So when I was about 8 years old, I realized and was disappointed that I realized I missed the bicentennial of America. I felt so cheated, and I was just like, I felt like I had just missed out on the biggest opportunity of my life. And eventually I consoled myself realizing that I would probably be alive for the 250th anniversary, and that felt pretty special too. I grew up with a deep love for our country. I learned stories of courage and sacrifice, and I believed that America was unique. Anybody else in that boat? Yes. And as I've gotten older, that love has not disappeared, but it has become more complicated. I've had to reckon with both the beauty of our story and history, and also those parts that we'd rather forget, and to be honest, we've done a really good job of burying. So the question in this whole sermon series that we've been asking is, how do we love our country honestly? How do we acknowledge its failures without giving up hope? And what does following Jesus have to do with any of this, right? So that's what we've been focused on. 2 weeks ago, Reverend Bill Oberle knocked it out of the park, to use an American pastime, the great American pastime. Just knocked it out of the park with a sermon. I loved his imagery of Uncle Sam and Jesus walking into the same bar, right? Like that just, I was thinking about that all week. And last week, Pastor David showed up with what happens when faith becomes a tool for gaining power and for protecting that power. And I'm thankful for his lens as a South African that has literally been through this and witnessed the movement of seeking power for people rather than for self. So thank you for that. Today I want to ask a different question, which is, how should Christians live within the society where God has placed us? And throughout history of Christianity, we've answered that in different ways. Some have said, let's just withdraw from society completely. And others have said, let's try to control and dominate society. And I believe that that Jeremiah and later Jesus offers us a better way between those two paths. So let's start with Jeremiah. This is a really well-known passage. Most people know Jeremiah 11, which is the part where it says, I know the plans I have for you, the plans for peace and not disaster, and for a future with hope. How many of you have held on to that at a time in your life that has felt really hard? Yes. But those words become even more powerful when we remember who heard them first. When we remember the first part of this story, Jerusalem had fallen, the temple was destroyed, the king was gone, and thousands of people were in exile. They were a people without hope. Old Testament scholar, Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney, invites us to imagine it this way. So just imagine. Our national government has just collapsed as a result of a foreign power. There's no military. There's no government. The president, first lady, cabinet, and Congress have all been captured and exiled to a different land. All the artists in New York and the steel workers in Pittsburgh also have been separated from their family and exiled. This is the world Jeremiah is speaking into. And he was, just as an aside, he was a failed prophet, because if he had been a prophet worth his weight in gold, he also would have been exiled. But he's kind of a reject prophet. They didn't think it was worth exiling him. So Jeremiah is speaking into this world, and there are false prophets who are telling people, oh, don't worry, this will all be over soon. But Jeremiah says the exact opposite. He says, you're going to be here a while. This is going to be hard. And so stop waiting for life to begin again. and live it now. Build houses where you are, plant gardens where you are, get married and raise children. And also pray for the city. This city that you have been exiled to, that is full of people who harmed you. Seek the welfare of that city and the people. We've all had those moments of exile, right? Times where we have felt the loss of something that we thought was unbreakable, where we have felt our world fall apart and everything in it, we feel like we're exiles in a strange land. And the first thing that Jeremiah says to that, before there's ever a strategy for the city, the first thing that he says is just be an ordinary human being and live your life right here where you are. Before you seek someone else's exile, I give you permission to live again in this great disappointment that you're carrying. But then, notice too, Jeremiah walks that fine line. He doesn't just let them assimilate and go away. He also doesn't say, destroy Babylon. He tells them to become a blessing right where they are. And as the people do that, God slowly rebuilds their lives. So the story, back to our country, the story that we often tell about our country skips over the fact. In fact, as I was writing my sermon, my first draft said, we've never experienced anything like this in American history. And then it just hit me like a ton of bricks. Yeah, we have. We exiled the people that were native to this land. Long before any of the Europeans arrived, the Potawatomi and their nations who called this land home were forced out, and it wasn't a choice. They were exiled. But in recent history, in our common life together, we haven't had a mass exile. We've had tremors over the past decade that many of us, and I want to say Republicans and Democrats and independents, have experienced moments that shook our confidence in this country. And for me, one of those was January 6th. It challenged assumptions that I had always held about a peaceful transition of power. And 6 years later, we still sit here with a elected president who continues to speak of violence and hatred toward his own people. So when I say some parts of me feel exiled from this country, I don't mean it in the way that Judah did or the Potawatomi did. I mean it in a disoriented sense. That's probably a more honest word. The country that I imagined as a child isn't quite the country that I experience today. Anybody else there? But God has not abandoned this in-between place. And Jeremiah still speaks into us, saying, don't give up, don't withdraw, don't try to control. Seek the welfare of the city. Now, Jesus has another image for this that I really like as I was sitting in this. Jeremiah is great, but I'm going to bring in the gospel too, sorry. Jesus talks about yeast. In chapter 13:33, he says, the kingdom of heaven is like yeast, which a woman took and hid in a bushel of wheat flour until the yeast had worked its way through all of the dough. And then a few chapters later, he speaks about yeast again to his disciples, 16:6. And he says, watch out and be on guard for the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So we've got this same image of yeast and yet opposite warnings. And I think that's the point. Good yeast doesn't take over the kitchen. You can't see it working. It doesn't announce itself or demand credit or rearrange the whole loaf around itself. It just quietly works until one day there's bread. And that's the kingdom of heaven. It's hidden and patient and present in the middle of ordinary life when we are planting gardens and having children. Jeremiah says plant, Jesus says be yeast. But the Pharisee yeast that Jesus warns about is hidden too. It also works its way through the dough without being seen, but instead of welfare, it seeks control. Instead of serving others, it seeks to protect power. And it's all dressed up so carefully in the language of righteousness that you can't always tell it apart from the real thing until the whole loaf has changed shape. Are you tracking with me? So whenever Christianity becomes a tool for gaining cultural dominance instead of loving our neighbors, as Christians, we become the wrong kind of yeast. White Christian nationalism is one expression of that temptation. It confuses influence with faithfulness and power with discipleship. White Christian nationalism is real yeast. It's just doing the wrong work. It rises toward domination instead of welfare. And so instead of withdrawal or domination, Jesus offers us another way to plant gardens and to be transformed from within ourselves. I keep thinking about that 8-year-old who was disappointed with missing the bicentennial. And at 8, I wanted to celebrate. I wanted an uncomplicated pride in my country. And if I'm honest, I still want that. But as a Christian, I'm not sure that our call isn't to throw this big, uncomplicated party. And sure, celebrating is fine. I sat in Michigan City and watched the most beautiful fireworks show I'd seen over the lake. It was gorgeous. But that firework show is over. The celebration of our country's founding is over in many ways. And now the work begins of building homes and planting gardens in this country, knowing we're called to be yeast in this country's dough for our lifetime. That's the work of discipleship. Our early Methodist, it's in our DNA, our early Methodist movement did this. I loved Jay's sermon where he shared that story of John Wesley going to and visiting the man in prison that was on sodomy charges. That's being yeast, right? Visiting the people that nobody else wanted to visit. Starting schools for kids that nobody else wanted to teach. Standing up against slavery when it costs something to say so. And today, we continue to do that. It might look like mentoring a student. That's planting a garden. That's being yeast. It might look like serving in our pad shelter that will be opening in October. It might be welcoming a refugee. PADS, by the way, if you're new, is our public action to deliver shelter for folks who are experiencing homelessness or living without a house. It might look like, and this is a hard one, showing up for a neighbor who votes differently than you. That's really yeasty. Or advocating for someone with no voice or volunteering in our community. It looks like seeking the welfare of the city. So this week, as you go about your week, I want you to ask yourself, how can I increase someone's welfare? Because that is the honoring and celebrating and living into the vision of who God calls us to be. Amen.